CGQ Plus.
It's funny because people often watch these flashback episodes and they'll end up leaving some kind of comment about how, it's amazing that I can remember all these details from way back in the day. And it's funny because oftentimes I find that my memory of those times is a little bit faulty. Excuse me for the bumping. And it's kind of one of the things that's good about the fact that I don't try to push these flashback episodes out too quickly, because I spend a lot of time thinking about like what I'm going to talk about, or like, I'll make little notes on a pad of like, oh, okay, I got to talk about this. And in fact, that happened with this episode. Like I thought I knew what I was going to talk about for this episode, and I started writing it down and realizing, oh, that's too much. I got to split that up into 2 episodes because things kind of come into focus more. Like, okay, this happened at the same time as that, or whatever. You see like logical ways to split things up. And so one of the things that happens there is you go, okay, summer of 92, for example, is when I got this, right? And then you go do the research and you realize, well, wait a minute, that thing didn't even come out until like the fall of 92. So like, that's not even possible. So it's funny that sometimes you have these memories that you're carrying around that, you think are real. Like you just know like, oh, okay, like, for example, like I said in the Genesis episode, that I got my Sega Genesis on my 15th birthday, which is true. But it turns out I have other memories similar to that where it turns out like, oh, no, that wasn't actually the case. Like you didn't get that that summer. And obviously things like that don't really matter. But, if it wasn't for the fact that I did this show, I would just go through the rest of my life just thinking things that it turns out aren't true. One thing I wanted to just sort of talk about a little bit before we get into today's topic, the last episode, when did that come out? A couple months ago or something. I was talking about how much I hated school, which like that's a hot take, right? But I guess just sort of based on some of the stuff I said, like a few people left comments, saying how like, oh, it was maybe like a little bit of a dark episode, like not complaining or anything, but just saying like, oh, like things maybe took a dark turn or something like that. And I guess one thing I just kind of wanted to say, I felt this way for a long time, is that if you're happy with yourself and you're happy with like where you are in life, or I don't know how else to put that, you can't really have too many regrets about the past or too many things where you want to feel like, oh, I wish I had done this differently, or I wish I had done that differently, or I wish this hadn't happened to me, or whatever. Like if you're happy with who you are as a person, you have to kind of just take all of those things as being like the building blocks that like made you who you are, So like, for instance, people seem to think that like, oh, maybe it was sad that, I spent so much time by myself, when I was growing up as a teenager, right? Like I mentioned how my mom would just kind of stay in her room and my grandma would stay in her room. And, I basically made my own dinner every night and just watched TV by myself. But like, I'm not talking about that from like the point of view of, oh, what a bummer that is or something. It's just like that really helped form the kind of person that I am now. And the fact that like, I'm perfectly comfortable being by myself and like, I can entertain myself. And I like that about me. And so like the fact that that kind of stuff, happened or whatever you want to call it, I don't see that as a bad thing. But I just feel like if I'm going to tell this whole story, then I have to talk about that kind of stuff. Like if I can geek out for a second, there was a really good episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation that dealt with that exact issue. It was called like Tapestry, I think. And like Q takes Captain Picard like back in time and lets him like relive these different moments in his life that he had regrets about. And he was able to, kind of redo those moments the way that he wishes he had done it. And then, of course, his life turned out very differently in a way that he didn't like. And so I forgot like the line that he says at the end of the show is something about like, when you start pulling at the loose threads that make up the tapestry of your life, like the whole thing comes apart. And that's really true. I mean, certainly we all have things where we can say, well, gee, I wish, like I wish my dad hadn't died when I was 15 or things like that. Or like for some people may have other like really tragic events or horrible things that happen to them that, obviously you can't ever get to a point where you're like, oh yeah, I'm glad that this awful thing happened, because then I wouldn't be who I am now. But like, let's be honest, if we're talking about the fact that like, I didn't have a lot of friends in high school, or, like I had, a mom that maybe wasn't really paying that much attention to me when I was a teenager, that's really not that big of a deal, So like, let's put things in the proper perspective. Anyway, so the thing we're going to talk about today, it's kind of crazy because I totally forgot to talk about this whole topic. Like at one point I was like, okay, the next episode of Flashback, I'm going to talk about getting a sound card for my computer, because I'm kind of focused on that because I'm really excited to make that episode. But I totally forgot about what we're going to talk about today, which is my modem. So, and this would have happened sometime, I would say this was freshman year of high school, because for sure Stuart was still around. But kind of much like, I got my hard drive as sort of a hand-me-down from Stuart's dad, although that did come in exchange for something. But what else did I get from them? I don't remember. The video card, right? Because that was the whole way that happened, was like I got a video card that was like too new for my computer. So I traded Stuart's dad, and he gave me a slightly older video card that was still a Super VGA card. And then to like make up the difference, he gave me that 20 megabyte hard drive, which was a pretty huge improvement because like in one fell swoop, I had color graphics on my computer and I had a hard drive. But the other thing that I got, not at the same time, but I don't know, sometime around that time, was I got a modem from Stuart. And what I'm sure happened, I don't remember this for a fact, but what I'm sure happened is that Stuart's dad probably got a new modem. Because as I've mentioned before, Stuart's dad was a video game programmer who worked for Sierra. But, Sierra was located at that time. Eventually they moved to Seattle, and now I don't know if they even really exist anymore on their own. But at that time, Sierra, their offices were in like this little mountain town right outside of Yosemite, which, we didn't live there. So, Stuart's dad sort of, I guess, telecommuted, if you want to call it that. I mean, he had his home office and he would just, do his game programming. And then I would imagine, uploaded it or something to Sierra, and worked with his teammates that way. So you can imagine that he would want to have a good modem, right? So, this would have been like 91, 92. Like, I don't know when like 14.4 modems came out or whatever, but you could imagine perhaps he got like, say, a 14.4 modem and then kicked down whatever he was using to Stuart. Like, let's just say for the sake of argument, it was a 2400 baud modem that he gave to Stuart. And then Stuart turned around and just gave me his 1200 baud modem. Because for sure that was what I had, was a 1200 baud modem. It was an external modem, which I think at that time was more common. The main reason for having a modem back then, well, I guess I can't say the main reason. The main reason for us was to call local BBSes, which BBS stands for like bulletin board system or bulletin board service. I don't remember which. Now, back then, like, I don't know when AOL started, but certainly like CompuServe goes all the way back into like the 80s, maybe even the early 80s. So there were like larger, national scale internet service providers that you could dial into. Of course, the World Wide Web as we know it didn't really exist back then. I mean, kind of it did. I think the first time I saw the World Wide Web was not until 1993, and we'll talk about that later. But if you had like, you'd have like CompuServe, and CompuServe would have like its own message boards. There was like, you could have like email, I believe. I mean, I never got to dial into CompuServe, so anything I know is just things I've read in old magazines or whatever. But my point is just that I think for most people, especially maybe kids our age, we weren't so much even interested in stuff like that. We just wanted to call local BBSes. And what was common back then is that there would be maybe like a text file or something that listed all of the local BBSes, at that time or something. And either that text file would get passed around, or even just like somebody would print it out on their dot matrix printer. And just like, that's how I got mine, is somebody gave me a hard copy of that. And it would just have like, it'd be a list, like here's the name of this BBS and the phone number, maybe the name of the sysop is what you call the system operator, like that was whoever owned the BBS. And it would just be this huge list. And so you would just sit down like, all right, well, I don't want to play a video game or whatever. I'm going to sit down and play with my modem. And you would just go down this list and start calling these places. And I think the two programs I remember using, one of them was called Procom, but I think I used a different one before that maybe it was called like Telix or something, Telix. I'm not positive. It doesn't really matter, but you would load this program and it would still just be text, and you'd have to type like ATDT blah 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 on the phone number, and it would call the number. But what was funny is that these files weren't kept like super up to date, and so some of those BBSs didn't exist anymore. And so sometimes you'd call the BBS, and there was the little speaker inside the modem. And because, you would hear the tones that, the modem would send out, the modem you were calling would send out a tone, and then yours would send the tone back, and then you'd hear the static. But if it wasn't a modem picking up the phone, sometimes you would hear that automated message from the phone company that said, like, you're calling a number that is invalid or whatever. But sometimes you would just hear somebody answer the phone, like, hello, hello. And it's funny because that must have happened, pretty regularly. And so you could imagine, like, if you used to run a BBS, or God forbid, if you got a new phone number that used to be from a BBS, and you were going to constantly have to pick up the phone and have some modem trying to talk to you, that would be annoying. But, anyway, you would end up, like, I think, you'd end up kind of marking on the list and be like, okay, you'd cross this one out, that doesn't work. Or, you'd make notes like, oh, this is a good BBS, like they have a lot of stuff. So that's what I wanted to talk about, like what kind of stuff would you encounter on a BBS at that time? And certainly some of you guys will have different experiences as far as what you did. Like I said, a BBS was supposed to be like a bulletin board system, I guess. So I don't know if maybe it had its roots just being a place where you could like post messages to each other, which I guess would be kind of cool. But, by the time I got into calling BBSs, you could still do that kind of stuff, but it really wasn't why most of us were there. The main reason for calling a BBS, and I should mention this, most of the BBSs I called were single line BBSs, meaning that it only had one incoming phone line. So if you called and it was busy, you got the busy signal you'd hear on the modem, you would know, okay, somebody else has already dialed into there. Normally it was a one line, and that's the kind of information that might be on that sheet. Like, okay, this is a one line BBS. And then the only person you might be able to chat with is the sysop. And I remember doing that at least once, because sometimes it would be an option on the BBS, which, by the way, BBSs were all text and ASCII graphics. Usually color ASCII graphics. I don't remember ever seeing one that was only black and white, because why would it be? But there were no, like, I don't know, can I say pixel graphic? I don't know how to explain. There wasn't that kind of graphics. Everything was just ASCII. And so you would just have like menus, like text menus, and you would just press a letter, like, A for whatever, B for whatever, like, and like maybe you press C would be like chat with the sysop. And so sometimes I would hit that just, well, maybe the sysop's around. It would just be fun. Like at that time, just the fact that you could chat with somebody remotely on your computer, to me was like a very novel thing. It's like, well, I don't even know this dude, but just being able to do that would just be neat. For me, at least, the main reason for calling in to BBSs was to download files. And sort of the main things I remember, like, well, the first thing I was going to talk about was downloading pictures. Because I talked about, when I mentioned getting a color monitor, I talked about like Stuart and I going to the computer store, and you would see like these displays, like this is back when we still had monochrome monitors. You'd go see these displays, sorry about the train if you can hear it, showing like, I think I mentioned before, there was a picture of like a rose that probably today would be considered a low resolution picture. But at the time it was like mind blowing. Like it was so like photorealistic that just being able to look at pictures on your computer screen had entertainment value, in and of itself. And so that was one of the things I would call into a BBS and you'd go into the files section, and then that would be like further broken down. And like, so two of the categories would be like things like images or pictures, and then games, which I'll get to in a second. But like I would just download pictures, or, you know, you would trade like picture files with your friends and stuff like that. The program that I remember using for looking at pictures on my computer, we just called it CShow because it was like cshow.exe, which I later found out stands for CompuShow. And it's funny because you can still download CompuShow. And I did. I ran it in DOSBox, and it works just like it's supposed to. But it was like a pretty full-featured, image viewing program. Like you would, because it was CShow, and then there was one called 2Show, and I remember I had both of them. And then I found out later that they're both CompuShow, and one of them is just a much later version. But anyway, so you would just launch like CShow, and you got this interface that, again, it just used like ASCII graphics, but it used the mouse, and, you know, it would show you like, here's like a list of your directory with all of your images in it. And you would just go double click on one of those images, and then a little like text box would pop up, like asking you which video resolution or video mode you wanted to use to look at that image. And it would, whichever one was actually the image resolution of the image would be the one that was like automatically selected. But like you would just have fun, like, oh, I'm going to see what this video looks, or what this image rather looks like in black and white, or what does it look like if I look at it in this lower resolution or whatever. And then part of the reason for that was, you know, you'd get some of these images that were a little bit higher resolution. And again, by today's standards, not high resolution, but they'd be high enough resolution that you'd have to wait. Like it would be drawing the image line by line on the screen. And so you would just see the image just slowly like as it was loading. And so maybe you'd load it in the lower resolution just so you wouldn't have to sit through all of that. And that was pretty cool. But, The main reason I think for calling a BBS was downloading shareware, which, oh man, I forgot I was going to get. Let me get it real quick. Have I ever shown this before? I have like a shareware disk. Just a second. All right. So I think I've talked about shareware a little bit on the show before. So some of this is going to be maybe a retread, but now we just take it for granted that you can like fire up, your Xbox or your PlayStation or Steam, and just download demo versions of games that you wanted to check out. But, as somebody who grew up playing, Nintendo, there was no demo. Like, as I've said before, you went to Toys R Us and bought a game like based on the box art, and hopefully it was good, because if not, you just blew your birthday present, or, blew a bunch of lawn mowing money or something. So to be able to get shareware, which was really just demo versions of PC games, was really awesome, because a lot of times those shareware versions of games had enough value, like gameplay value, that for someone like me that couldn't really afford to go down to like Software Etc. Or whatever and blow a bunch of money on games, I could just play the demo versions of these games. So like, again, I can't remember if I showed these before or not, but like, these are still sealed too, but like there's Wolfenstein 3D shareware version on a 3.5-inch disc. And then I also have Blake Stone, which coincidentally runs on the same engine as Wolfenstein 3D. So I didn't get my shareware copy of Wolfenstein 3D from a BBS. I got it from Stuart. But I did get some other game demos. And there's two demos that I really remember downloading and spending quite a bit of time playing. And before I talk about them, I wanted to talk about kind of like file size and modem speed and other limitations calling a BBS. Like some BBSs would have like a time limit so that you couldn't just park out like all day. It would be like, okay, you can have 30 minutes or whatever, and then it would automatically kick you off. I think others might have had like a total data, like a total data transfer limit. I don't remember that as much, but it was something you had to take into consideration. Like, so you'd go to like the game section in the file section. Okay, well, I'm going to see what games these people have to download. And it would just be a list that would have like the file name, the size, and then not even really a full sentence worth of description usually. Like, so you didn't really know what you were getting, but it was free. So it wasn't really that big of a deal. But for instance, the first game I was going to talk about today is Captain Comic. And the shareware, the size of the shareware file for Captain Comic is 90 kilobytes, right? So by today's standards, it's super tiny, right? But on a 1200 baud modem, 90 kilobytes takes about 10 minutes to download. And if you had like a time limit, okay, I can only be on here for so long, you'd have to take that into consideration. Okay, how much time do I have left? Do I have time to download this? Okay, I'll get it, you know. And but you would just like figure stuff out. Like I didn't know what Captain Comic was. I was just like, well, let me just download this and see what it's like. And so a lot of demos, you would download them and you'd try them like, oh, this sucks. And so then you would just delete it, especially when hard drive space for me was at a premium. But so the two games I wanted to talk about, there's something else we have to talk about that goes hand in hand with those two games. And that is the Gravis PC GamePad. So, sorry, it looks a little bit overblown, but if I put it over here, does that help in the shade? Not really. So I don't remember exactly when I got my Gravis PC GamePad, but it was definitely before I got my sound card. And the reason I say that is because back then sound cards had a game port on them. So I mean, I can't imagine anybody's watching this doesn't already know this, but you know, the plug for the game port on a computer, it's 15 pin, but unlike a VGA, which is like a HD 15, so it's 3 rows, this is 15 pins in 2 rows. And like no computer that I know of back then came with a game port. So you had to either buy a card that was just a game port card, or if you got a sound card, those always, I've never seen a sound card from back then that didn't have a game port on it, although I'm sure some of them existed. So I really don't remember. This is not my original PC GamePad. I do still have my original PC GamePad, but it's kind of gotten yellowed. Back then, my desk was right underneath the window in my bedroom. And so like I still have my original PlayStation, but it's all yellow. And then this is all yellow. I don't still have any of my original computer hardware. I'm sure it got a little bit yellowed too. But I found this one in a thrift store, and this one still looks nice. So I figured I would show you guys this one instead. But I don't remember when I got it exactly. These were not terribly expensive. But again, I would have had to buy some kind of card. I don't know if maybe where I bought it, there was like a bundle deal or something, or, you know, again, I don't remember where I got it. So, but I would have had to buy a game port card at the same time. And, you know, I'm not going to spend too much time going over it. You can see it looks similar to a Super Nintendo controller. It does not have shoulder buttons. It's got 4 face buttons, which standard PC joystick only has 2 buttons. And so you could only use all 4 buttons as separate buttons if a game was specifically programmed for that. And so an example of that would be Wolfenstein 3D, which I definitely use this controller to play. It supported this gamepad like internally. So you could use it in 4-button mode and have the 4 buttons, you know, each individually perform a different function, which was great because what you would do is you'd have fire, you know, your gun. And then like, I don't know if it called it, I think it called it open, right? For opening a door, fire, open, strafe, and run. You could have all on separate buttons, and Wolfenstein let you pick which button did what, which was also really cool. For games that didn't support the 4-button mode, you had to flip one of these switches. There's a switch on the top and a switch on the bottom, and it's funny because they're not labeled, but I mean, it's only 2 switches, so it's not that big of a deal. But one button is for like, or one switch rather is for 2-button or 4-button mode. So if it's in 2-button mode, that's actually kind of cool too, because when it's in 2-button mode, you know, you have button 1, button 2, and then the other 2 buttons are turbo versions of button 1 and button 2. So I don't remember ever using that for anything, but that would have been cool. And then the other switch, which I think was probably used a lot less frequently, was what they called a left-handed mode, where it would reverse all of the D-pad functions, so that if you wanted to play it, you know, use your right hand for the D-pad and your left hand for the buttons, you could go ahead and do that. Apparently, according to so this guy Benj Edwards that I follow on Twitter actually just coincidentally wrote an article about the Gravis PC GamePad for he works for that website howtogeek.com. And so like I didn't know some of the stuff that he mentioned. I'll put a link, if I remember, I'll put a link in the description to that article just because I thought it was kind of cool. But, you know, of course, back then, other game companies or other game hardware companies had to kind of make sure that they made their directional pads different enough to Nintendo's D-pad design to not get sued. So like you can see this is like a disc instead of being a cross D-pad. And anybody that ever had one of these controllers will remember, you can maybe, I don't know if you can see it or not, but right in the middle of that disc is a threaded socket, because this came with a little like that, like an inch and a half maybe long little stick that you could screw in there. Which, I mean, did anybody ever use that thing? I think I tried it and was like, oh, this is stupid, and threw it away. But Benj Edwards suggested that that may have been done to further differentiate this controller from a Super Nintendo controller. And he also thinks that's why it has sort of this asymmetrical design, where on this side it bulges up and this side it bulges down, was, maybe just to make sure that they didn't get into legal trouble. But anyway, the reason I bring that up is that the two games that I really remember playing that I downloaded from BBSes, the first is Captain Comic, which apparently Captain Comic, I mean, not apparently, it's a fact. Captain Comic was ported to the NES. I've never played it. I only learned that the other day when I was reading about Captain Comic for this episode. So I've never played that version. I'd be curious to play it. It's sort of like an action platform kind of game, like, unless you had like a VGA card or something, because Captain Comic runs an EGA. Back then, because Captain Comic, I should say, came out in 1988. And, back then PC hardware wasn't really made to be able to scroll graphics, like the way a home console could. So stuff like Captain Comic and then later Commander Keen, it was pretty cool that you had like the scrolling graphics, because it was a game that played more like a console game. I think that's part of the reason that computer games were so different than console games was due to sort of graphical hardware limitations. But Captain Comic's a pretty cool game, and like the demo version of it is not really all that short. So you're this little guy who's ostensibly Captain Comic, and it sort of has almost this Metroid thing going on, where it's like this it's a pretty open world. It does not have like discrete levels. Like you'll just be in an area and there's like a door you can go through that takes you to some other area. And, that area will have different doors that take you to other areas, but you have to kind of like go around and find items that will allow you to access new areas. So very much like Metroid. Like for instance, you can get like, I think it just looks like a shoe in Captain Comic, but it lets you jump higher, and you need that to be able to get to like a certain area. Other power-ups you can find, they have these things, they look like soda cans with fireballs on them, because Captain Comic can like throw fireballs, but he can only throw one at a time. But each time you pick up one of those little can things with a fireball on it, like, well, now you can throw two at a time, and then 3, 4. I've never gotten more than 5, so I don't know what the limitation is. But like then there's like another power-up you get, looks like a wine corkscrew. And what that does is that makes your fireballs move in like a wave pattern, kind of like the Batman Game Boy game. But that's pretty cool. But it's a really neat game. One of the things I think is really cool about that, early in the game, you get to the spot where there's a rocket with a door on it. And I think there's a sign that says something like tour the moon or visit the moon. And you get in the rocket, and then when you get out of the rocket, you're on the moon. And then the gravity is different. So instead of like, on Earth or wherever Captain Comic is, you can jump some certain height. But when you get to the moon, you can jump like all the way to the top of the screen, which I just thought was kind of a neat little feature. But if you keep your expectations calibrated, I think it's a cool game. It runs just fine in DOSBox. It doesn't have as far as I know, it doesn't have any sound card support. So it just uses the PC speaker. So I don't think there's even really, there's music in that if you pick up an item, there's a little jingle that happens. But there are sound effects, but it's just PC speaker. So again, just keep your expectations calibrated. But I think it's a cool game, and it does have joystick support. So that was kind of my point, is like that's a game that works great with like a PC gamepad. Wouldn't be as fun, in my opinion, to play with a keyboard. And then the other game, which I actually ironically don't have as much to say about, is Commander Keen. And I don't know a whole lot about the game, except that I listened to a podcast several years ago where John Romero was being interviewed, because John Romero was the primary guy that made Commander Keen. And apparently, originally, he was making a PC port, like unauthorized PC port of one of the Super Mario games. Like, I don't know if it would have been Super Mario 3, because based on the way Commander Keen plays, you would think it would be like Super Mario 3. But similar gameplay style to Commander Comic. It's a side-scrolling, action platform game. And the reason I say that maybe it was Super Mario 3 is that Commander Keen has like an overworld map. So when the game first starts, you're on this planet and you have to go walk to like the first area that you're going to go into. But, Super Mario Brothers has like those lines connecting the different areas and you can only walk along those lines. But Commander Keen doesn't work that way. You can just walk around and just go into whatever area you want to go into. And, by going in there, you pick up items that you'll need for later. Again, as far as I don't remember any Commander Keen supporting a sound card. But again, these were both games I was playing before I had a sound card. And once I got a sound card, I was playing other games. And so it's possible that some of those games supported like, digital sound, and I just don't know. But it was another cool game. And the reason I bring up those two games specifically, aside from it giving me an excuse to talk about the Gravis PC GamePad, is that it was really the only two games that I remember downloading from a BBS and spending significant amounts of time playing. Because, as I mentioned before, especially when Stuart was gone, I spent a lot of weekends just sort of at home, by myself, or I spent, evenings kind of by myself. And like I said, I entertained myself, so it wasn't a big deal. But that was one of the ways. It's like, okay, well, I'm going to sit down and just spend like the whole afternoon or the whole evening playing Captain Comic or playing Commander Keen. And, it's funny because those games really, it's not even really an arguable point that they're not as good as side-scrolling action games on the NES. Like, nobody wants to play Commander Keen instead of like Contra or Ninja Gaiden or something. But kind of going back to what I was saying about, chatting online or about just looking at pictures with C-Show, just the fact that you were doing it on a computer, it had like this novelty to it, like that made it cool. Like, yeah, I'm playing a sort of mediocre side-scrolling action game, but I'm playing it on my computer. And like, I don't know, somehow for me at least, that made it kind of cool. I can't really explain why. But the other thing I wanted to talk about as far as BBSs go is door games. And I really only have one door game to talk about. But that was another feature of BBSs. You get on the BBS and one of those main menu items would be door games. And I don't know where they get the name. I don't know what's door about them. They're just games, but they're online games. And a lot of those games were really kind of dumb. Like, it would have like checkers or chess or backgammon. Although I'm assuming, I don't know this for a fact, I'm assuming that you could play those against another human being if the BBS allowed multiple people to call in. So that would be what made it cool. Like I tried, because I found a BBS that I could access. It's through Telnet, but I can just use their website. Like they have a website where you can, in the web browser, Telnet to their BBS. And so I was checking out some of the door games, and like, it had backgammon, and I enjoy playing backgammon. And, so I played some Ascii Backgammon, and it was fine, but I was playing against the computer. But, back in the early 90s, if I was playing against another human, that would have been really cool. But the main door game that I remember playing was called, well, still is called Tradewars 2002, or we just all called it Tradewars. And it's funny because, so that was the main reason that I found this BBS that I was able to access through their website, was because I wanted to play some Trade Wars, because I knew I was going to be talking about it, on this episode, and I hadn't played Trade Wars in at least 10 years. But also just because I thought it would be fun to play some Trade Wars again. So to me, at least in my opinion, that was the most popular door game to play. And so what Trade Wars was, again, it's all ASCII graphics, so it's pretty much just text. You'd start a new game. So it would save your game. Like it would associate whatever game you were playing, it associated it with your BBS login. So you'd go to Trade Wars and it knew that you were you, because you had to sign up for accounts with these BBSs, like, username and password. So it would know that it was like you when you logged in, or when you launched Trade Wars rather. And it would give you, like, you started off and you had like a spaceship and a certain amount of money. And the Tradewars universe, it was like this huge universe made up of sectors. And the sectors were all connected to each other in like weird ways. I'm not going to do a good job of explaining this because Tradewars is pretty complicated. But you would get a home planet that would be in some sector. And then you could use your ship to travel around to different sectors. And you would just type in the sectors they were just numbered. Like it, you know, when the sysop sets up Tradewars, they can set how many sectors big a universe is. But let's just say for the sake of argument, it's 10,000 sectors because that's the game I got going on right now. So, you know, all of the sectors had just 4 digits, you know, 5382 or whatever. And so like if you typed in 5382, it would calculate, okay, here's how you have to get there. You're going to go through all these other sectors because they're all connected together in weird ways. Like 1 is not connected to 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Like they're all just sort of connected. There's a word for how they're connected together. I don't know the word, but a lot of these sectors would have like outposts or trading posts in them. And at those trading posts, you could buy and sell. It's ore, like ore, O-R-E, equipment, or organics and equipment are the 3 things that you could trade. And it kind of worked like if anybody out there has ever played like Drug Wars, or it's also called Dope Wars, which was also a text-based game, but that one's not an online game. You know, you would go to certain places in Dope Wars, and I think at those places you could buy or sell anything in any of the places. But in Trade Wars, like, okay, this outpost is buying ore and selling organics and equipment. And they would all be selling for different prices, but the price was based on how much of those things they had on hand. So if they had a surplus of ore, it would be cheap. And then if they were selling ore and it was a surplus, it would be cheap. And so maybe you'd want to buy it. If they were selling equipment, but they didn't have that much of it, the price would be high. And so the idea is that you were trying to buy low and sell high. And so you'd go around this universe, you know, buying and selling stuff. Ideally, you would find 2 adjacent sectors where one of them was selling organics and buying equipment, and the other one was buying organics and selling equipment, and you would just bounce back and forth between those 2 sectors and just make tons of money. And the reason for that is that the other one, or at least one of the other parameters that the sysop would set, is the number of turns per day that you would get. So you're time limited, basically, you know, how much time you can spend playing Trade Wars, except that time is measured in turns, which made for a very interesting little parameter for the game, because the way you spent turns was going between sectors. Like if I go from this sector to the next sector, that's going to cost a certain number of turns. But how many turns it cost depended on what kind of ship you had. So like some ships maybe were better in some ways, like, oh, this ship can carry lots of stuff, but it's slower, and so it takes more turns to get from sector to sector. And so depending on what you were doing in the game, like early in the game, the whole point is to make a ton of money, because you want to like build up your home planet. You know, you want to put a citadel on your planet where you can have like a military installation, because this was a multiplayer game. And if it was a BBS that only had one line, only one person could play Trade Wars at a time. But if it was a multi-line BBS, multiple people will be playing the same game of Trade Wars at the same time. Like you could form corporations with other users, and you could fight against other corporations. You could just be like a rogue user, and you could go around the universe looking for other users, you know, because when you logged off the game, your ship was just wherever you left it. Like normally you'd want to go park your ship in your home sector where your home planet was. But, you know, if you were dumb or you ran out of turns, you wouldn't be able to get your ship home. And it was just a sitting duck wherever it was. So you could go destroy somebody's ship, and then you got all the credits that they had. You know, but then you would be like an evil, you know, I think if you were like evil or whatever, it didn't call it evil, but you had like an alignment score, and that alignment said whether or not you were good or bad. And I think if you were bad, there were certain things in the game you could no longer use, like, because there's like Earth, it's called Terra, I think, in the game. You go to Terra and pick up colonists, or I forgot what it's called, but there's like a main star base in the universe you can go to where you can like buy new ships or add like cargo holds to your ship or buy more fighters. But it was just a really cool game. I guess, like I said, it's kind of hard to explain unless you see it for yourself. But, so I've been playing this Tradewars game on this BBS that I talked about, but I don't think there's anybody else actively playing it. So it's like, it's not really that fun. Because part of the fun of it was that, like, again, this was like local BBSes, right? And so like I knew the other people, some of the other people playing this game of Tradewars. And, because usually we would use the same names across BBSes or whatever. Like we had our online handle, it was called back then. And so like I would know, like if you'd go to like a trading post and it will say, like if you were the first person to visit a trading post, you got some experience points. But if you weren't, like if somebody else had been there, it would say like, this is not the exact wording, but like, this trading post was last visited by whoever, and it would say like so many days ago. And so like I would see like, oh, my friend John was just here, or whatever. And that was kind of neat too. I remember my friend John and my friend Doug were both like really, really good at Tradewars. And so like you kind of didn't want to be, especially John, because John was always evil. He would always fly the main game. I posted a picture of this on Twitter and like nobody knew what game I was talking about. Like the main ship that you would get, I think primarily if you were evil, I think it was if you were evil, was called the Interdictor Cruiser. And like he always had an Interdictor Cruiser, and like you did not want to run into John. Like if you ended up in the same sector as John, he was going to blow your ass up. So you didn't want to do that. But that was part of what made the game cool, was all these other people were also playing it, even if not while you were on the BBS, just, they were all playing the same game. And so that was just like pretty neat. And, it was kind of like an early MMO, I guess, really. I mean, the game has a lot of role-playing game elements to it. And it's kind of like, I played an MMO for like, I don't know, a week when I was in college. It was called Dark Age of Camelot. And it was kind of the same thing where like you started off in Dark Age of Camelot, and the whole point was that you had to try to build up your character, and eventually you would go to this other area, I guess, I never saw it, where you would actually fight other players. And so, that's the only MMO I've ever played in my life, so I can't really speak intelligently about MMOs. But that's kind of how Tradewars worked, because at the beginning, you're just trying to like build up your ship, build up your planet, make money, and then at some point you're like, okay, now I'm ready to go like actually fight against people. But even if you didn't want to fight, just like getting together and pooling your resources with other people and having a corporation, even if you mainly just wanted to like build up planets and stuff together, it was fun in that way. So if that sounds kind of cool to you and you've never heard of Tradewars, just Google it, because like I said, there are still BBSs running Tradewars. And some of them, like the one I found, I'll put a link in the description if you want to just check that one out. But, you can just play it through your web browser. So it's not even like the headache of trying to figure out how to telnet somewhere or anything. So I think that's a good place to stop. I think this has been about 45 minutes. So this kind of went longer than I thought it would. We had something else I was going to talk about, but no big deal. We'll just talk about it next time. So so that's going to do it for this episode of Flashback. As always, thanks for watching. See you next time.